my name is Erin Jones, and I was born in this country, but not raised in this country. I was actually raised in the Netherlands after being adopted by a Scandinavian couple from northern Minnesota who adopted another little biracial baby and decided to raise us overseas. And so I attended the American School of The Hague, starting in 1976, graduated from there in 1989. Knew as a high school student I wanted to come back to the United States and go to the best college I could get into, and then go back to Europe and work at the United Nations, either as an interpreter, I spoke foreign languages, or as a lawyer. And realized in my first year of college in Philadelphia that kids who looked like me were not getting the same great education I had gotten, and called my parents at 20 and said, I'm not coming back. I am going to give back from what I was given, and I'm going to become a teacher. And not just a teacher, I want to make sure that every kid, regardless of zip code, race, and home language, gets a great education. And that work began for me at 20. It's been 25 years now of working in and around the system. I started teaching in South Bend, Indiana, where my husband went to graduate school. We moved to Tacoma about 19 and a half years ago. I stayed home for a little bit with my kids. We opened a school in our garage, and I taught out of my garage, the neighborhood. And then I started teaching in Tacoma. I taught English, I taught French immersion, everything in French, to mostly black and brown children. We took in a little girl whose mom was a former gangbanger, and her mother overdosed and died. And we decided to move away to Spokane to give her a fair start, a clean start. So we lived in Spokane for a couple years. I ended up winning the Milken Educator of the Year award in Spokane as a high school teacher, came back to work at OSPI, served there on the cabinet of Randy Dorn for 3 years, and have spent the last 4.5 years as a school district administrator. And my passion is really to create clear vision for the state, engage new voices in the conversation, and be visible across the state of Washington as a leader. Thank you.
So unfair. Should I shout for even?
Yes. You're okay.
All right. Good evening. My name is Chris Rakedell, and I am your other candidate for superintendent of public schools in our state. If there's one thing I can do in my life, I'm going to get rid of the phrase superintendent of public instruction, because as we've learned, 2% of the Washington population knows what that is. But they know what schools are, so, and you do too. My story is quite a bit different than Erin, and we've traveled the state together for the last year in some of our compare and contrast, and so I always want to ground people with where I come from, because it really is shaping my view of the world constantly. I was born and raised just north of here in Snohomish, a little town, the youngest of 8 kids and 2 parents with an 8th grade education. It was very, very difficult for lots of complicated reasons, not the least of which my parents lost their oldest 6 kids to the foster care system for 2 years. They put that family back together after some really important state intervention and got very sober and significantly healthier and safer, and for reasons unknown, but thankfully they had 2 more children, and I'm number 8, so that's how I got here. The result was a family really committed to the community because they understood that the community saved them. And I had this sense growing up that I would always do something to serve the public, because it was just in the ethos of my family, but it was tough because I was using food stamps on Saturday and Sunday, and then showing up to a classroom on Monday, and it wasn't until probably 3rd or 4th grade I looked around and said, this is awesome. I love school, and this is my place, and I don't feel different here. And that shaped my whole life. I became a teacher, first in my family to go to college. I was a history teacher at Longview. I ended up serving on a school board, so seeing both sides of the collective bargaining angle. 14 years in the community and technical college system, 6 years now in the legislature, currently the vice chair of House Education. I bring education, I bring policy to the role, I bring a finance background. It's a complicated role that requires that kind of executive leadership, and we'll get into it a little bit more later, but I'm very, very blessed to have lived a life of lens through poverty, because half of our students are experiencing that today, and it transcends race and ethnicity and geography. So thanks for having us here tonight. Look forward to the questions and appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so a reminder that we have 90 seconds.
We have 90 seconds for each of these responses. Okay, microphones are not my friend tonight. And we will start with Chris. How would you describe your role in education as the state superintendent of public instruction, and how will you translate that into engagement with the public at all levels of the education system?
Excellent. So this is a big question because a lot of people think of it as the K-12 system only, but the truth is there are early learning programs, 3 and 4-year-old programs, and some stuff earlier in our K-12 system to the tune of about 30,000 students just in that sector. So there's an early learning component, there's clearly the K-12 component, and as you know, we're kind of higher ed institutions as well. We have dual credit programs primarily for our juniors and seniors and increasingly now to some of our sophomores, but we're a transition system to higher education and post-secondary learning. Being 14 years in the community and technical college system and having worked with so many elements of those different sectors, I just think it's a critical role of OSPI to bridge that. You're in the center of a student development process, really from birth to career, as you heard the mission of some of our sponsors tonight. The unique role I bring is that I wouldn't be the hammer on policymakers. I wouldn't define the role by being sort of obtuse about funding, although we need to equitably and fully fund. I'd bring a different perspective, which is support. I've been in a system that has used research and data to transcend political ideology. You have a legislature today that wants to do all kinds of good things in early learning, K-12 and higher ed, but I can tell you that to your college sector, they pick up the phone and they say to our Community and Technical College Board, you guys are on the edge of great things nationally, you're respected. I've got an idea, what do you think? If we get to that place at OSPI where policymakers are saying we want to listen to the experts, they have the research and they're really mining the system of education for what's best practice, then we've achieved something powerful.
So I already mentioned this earlier, but I think about this in the sense of 3 V's. Having been in the system as a classroom teacher, as a district administrator, having worked at OSPI, but also as the mother of 3 kids who each have special learning needs. I don't like talking about disabilities because I think disabled means not able. I like to talk about learning differences. And so I've had to navigate the system as a mother too. Vision. As state superintendent, I believe it's my obligation to create a clear vision with the public. We don't have a strategic plan as a state that really creates a clearly articulated plan from early childhood, and that means birth, 3 years old, all the way through to post-secondary, whatever that means, apprenticeship, 2-year, 4-year, technical college, all of that. And so the first thing that I believe we need to do as an agency is to create a very coherent blueprint for the state, a clear vision for the state around what is great quality public education, because that will inform everything that we do. Legislatively, that will help inform school districts about programming, it will help inform parents and students. Number 2, we've got to get new voices at the table. We absolutely must have parents and students and teachers, not lobbyists and legislators alone. We've got to have them too, but we have to get new voices at the table to inform that plan. And lastly, we have to be visible. You have to see us out in your community. We can't represent people we don't know in places we've never seen. And so you will see us visible in your community, listening to you, learning from you, and elevating best practice.
Okay, thank you. Question number 2. In 2017, the legislature must finish its work on the McCleary education funding case. What's the biggest obstacle to completing that work? And what's the most important thing that the public needs to understand about it? And how can OSPI help bring various groups together to find a solution?
So I think what's really important is that we not polarize ourselves. And we see in this political climate today, from the president on down, such polarization. And so it's us against them, and the Senate didn't fund the budget or whatever. I mean, I hear lots of blaming of folks. We've got to put kids at the center and schools at the center and really get clear about this is about our young people and what can we do. We've got to lay down. It's going to require compromise. Absolutely going to require compromise. I think also it's really important that we prioritize. We've got to fix our levy situation right away, immediately. It's got to be fixed. And so when I think about the role of OSPI, it's really working with the legislature, but really creating some clear guidelines and some clear articulation of what are the gaps in our system to really clearly articulate for our school districts right now. If we don't fix levies, by the end of this year, we're going to have to release thousands of teachers across our state, and that's just not okay. And so I believe it's our job to really clearly articulate for the legislature, here are the priorities, here are how we prioritize. I believe it's also important for us to find those voices in community who can tell the story of where levies, where teacher shortages are having a huge impact, and having those people come and talk before the legislature, because they know my job is to represent the state. I'm paid to do that. They know when the lobbyist shows up, here's the message they're going to get. What they need to hear is from you, the people, and I absolutely want to create a platform for parents and teachers and students to come and share their stories of where are the greatest implications for lack of funding.
As I indicated earlier in an answer, the role of the superintendent, as the Constitution clearly defines, is all manner of supervision of our public school system. That means having a vision for what excellence looks like. It's not just raising $3.5 billion in taxes and putting into the existing formulas to say we have even more money to do what we've been doing. It is a sincere walk through the research and the data to say this is how an investment in something different within the basic education definition gets you a different outcome. And I'll use a very specific example. We need levy reform, there's no question about it. You're paying $1.50 per thousand in this community, it generates a pretty decent amount, you've got pretty high property values, you're leveraging some commercial real estate assets. If you live in the Yakima Valley, you're paying $4 and $5 per thousand and you're generating a lot less money per child. They don't have Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and all of residual home value that comes from that. So you gotta fix levies, but at the end of the day, if all you do is raise state property tax and lower local property tax, and you call that revenue neutral and even, you haven't really done anything for the 125,000 students in special education on IEPs who actually need them funded for success. You haven't done anything to bring career and tech ed programs back into our schools so that the 20% of kids who just aren't engaged in sort of a university pathway feel like they belong. We definitely need revenue reform. The superintendent should take a lead in helping the legislature understand the impacts of their contemplation, but go beyond it to say, now if you want results for all kids, 100% graduation, you gotta do things differently, and here's the path.
Thank you. Question 3 is, our school districts have extremely diverse populations with very different challenges, needs, and access to a quality education. How do you believe we can best close the opportunity gap across our student populations and specifically provide more equitable educational outcomes for all of our students?
90 seconds to solve a 100-year crisis. Are you ready? It clearly starts with early learning. And I know there are folks probably in this room who say that shouldn't be part of basic ed. We have our own problem getting kindergarten through 12th grade funded. And I would say it's an and conversation. We have to intervene earlier in the lives of young people, particularly those who are vulnerable and particularly those who come from communities of historic barrier. You gotta change outcomes from kids all the way to the way they map the brain to their vocabulary acquisition at early grades, early level. So as superintendent, you'd see me very engaged in a different way in early learning to change the conversation about what it means to have a successful K-12 system. You gotta have a successful early learning system. In addition to that, we obviously have to be very intentional through the entire process. Are we recruiting and retaining teachers of color? Do we actually create a financial incentive so that our classrooms look like our students? Do our school boards look like our school districts? We have to be intentional about the work, and that requires some financial incentive along the way. But you'll never recruit enough to actually change that outcome. You'll also have to do enormous professional development, which has been starved by the state for the better part of 30 years. The existing teaching staff and the support staff have to have professional development on what it means when they're in front of students of color, students in poverty, students in crisis, students who had adverse childhood experiences and significant trauma. If you want to change the outcome for students who have not participated in the same success as others, you got to change the approach to those students, and it means a holistic transformation of the way we develop our professionals.
So this is the work that I have committed the last 25 years of my life to. And when we talk about the opportunity gap, often people assume it's just about black and brown kids versus white kids. And the reality is, on our state, it depends on your zip code. So it may be black and brown kids, it may be rural, remote kids. And so really, how do we think intentionally about how that shows up in each space? I have trained over 20,000 teachers in the last 4 years in how to close opportunity gaps. And there are 4 things that I talk about all the time. Number 1, who are the adults in front of our young people? Do we have the most effective adults in front of our most vulnerable children? Because what is happening right now in the system is our most vulnerable kids often get the brand new teacher, or they get the paraeducator who doesn't get the support and training that they need to be successful with students. And so we have to get really intentional. I would also say we've got to do a better job in teacher education of preparing teachers to serve every population. We're not doing a great job at that yet. We're getting there in some schools. but who the adults are in the system is absolutely critical. Number 2, authentic family and community engagement is critical. We've got to see our families as equal partners in this work. Families are the first and forever teachers of their students, and we can no longer afford to say we are the school, we know best for your children. We have to see our community and our families as partners in this work. Third, we've got to address the needs of the whole child. That means the intellectual child, the physical child, the social emotional child, and the cultural child. And lastly, we've got to really intentionally address transitions. We're losing our students at the transition points as they move from one classroom to the next and from one grade to the next. And we can absolutely have an intentional plan to address that.
Thank you. Fourth question. This question is about options for families. If elected, how would your office support districts to help give families more options to meet the needs of their children, such as more STEAM career specializations, vocational learning, self-select challenge courses, alternative learning methods, charter schools, choice schools, or language immersion options?
So this is a great one for me. I just resigned from Tacoma School District, where I started my teaching career in the state and then finished as a school district director. And we have in Tacoma, we have a School of the Arts, we have a School of Math and Science, we have a School of Engineering, we have a STEAM school, we have 2 Montessori academies, we have a language immersion school. We have a plethora of options. We have an alternative learning environment for students who've been out of school and we're trying to get back. I think Tacoma is a great model district for alternatives and options for students. Has not always been that way. I will say that as a mom whose kids started there, who left that district because when my kids needed something different 15 years ago, it was not available. So I have been able to watch a district that transformed over time because of pressure from families who said, we want STEAM, we want STEM, we need other alternatives for our young people. And so I believe there are great models of school districts and buildings that are doing great work. And I believe it's the job of OSPI to elevate those models. We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. There are these great models that have existed for a long time, but the story hasn't been told. And so I see our office really as treasure hunters. How could we go across the state and tell the stories of great models that exist, and then help other school districts think about not how do we exactly replicate that, but what would that look like in our context, in our community? Because Tacoma is very different from here. It's very different from Walla Walla, what that might look like, but I think if we could get people to visit and see and hear the story, what were the challenges that Tacoma went through to get to that space, we could help folks begin to do more of that innovative work.
There's a pretty strong positive correlation between choice schools, particularly those run by a local school district. As you see in Tacoma, you see a little bit in Seattle. There are other districts doing some pretty remarkable work, but the strong correlation is big levy dollar producers. When districts have resources, they find the ability to create these options because sometimes the startup costs are high, and in the case of, say, a career in tech ed or a very special technical program, you should have pretty low student faculty ratios. You have high consumables. Sometimes you're in space like this, not a traditional classroom. The funding question becomes absolutely germane to choice. If you actually invest in our districts and keep them under the control of the public and you resource them effectively and fairly, they can go back to a place where they open up options for kids. In a 30-year model where we've sort of withdrawn our state investment and we've relied on local levies, districts that don't have big levy bases, they've had to pull back those offerings and say, listen, the only cost-effective model I can run in rural Washington is to stick the 31st, 32nd, 33rd, and 34th kid in a geometry class. Because it's marginally, it's very tiny in its added cost, but I can sure get a lot of leverage out of the state resource. It's a lot harder to say, you know what, 20 kids are going to thrive here, but 15 should be in a construction trades program where they're getting applied geometry. And oh, by the way, my economy locally needs that. So you can't separate choice from resource. And it's important that parents have lots of choices within the public domain and under the control of local districts, but you also have to resource them so they can take that risk. So as parents get down there and say, we want choices for our kids, they say, we can now accommodate that.
Thank you. You both recently participated in a forum hosted by the ARC of King County, where the discussion focused on how we can improve the education opportunities for students with disabilities. What did you learn about special education in that forum that would help improve the learning and outcomes for all children, not just students with disabilities?
That was a really remarkable forum, and we've had dozens of them, but that was one of the most energized events we've had in Seattle at Seattle Town Hall, and I'd say certainly beyond the forum, there's a lot of learning that goes on in this space. One of the things I've been working on for several years as a policymaker, and even before that in my higher education world, it was a clear understanding that when kids actually have a pathway, when it's written and developed, so that a counselor, a teacher, a parent, a student can all see that common pathway, that beyond plan, then you focus attention on success. Everyone's on the same page. Now, we've had IEPs in our state for a very long time. I would argue they're not fully and equitably funded, and it's actually a constitutional violation, in my opinion, what we're doing in special ed. But if we've learned anything from the special education population, it's that when we get focused on plans, we can map out success paths for kids. Why wouldn't we be doing that for all children? So the bipartisan work we've been working on the last couple of years is a high school and beyond plan. Sometimes it's a pretty rudimentary tool in some districts. Ideally, it would be a couple of really, really cost-effective online tools that parents could check into from a distance. But you got to get to a place where we're mapping out a pathway for every single student. So on day one, they say, I know what assessments I need, I know what courses I need, I know my options when I take these pathways, and I know that there's many ways to get to graduation and be successful. Today, we sort of say, well, you're going north and the treasure's on the map out here, but we'll just talk about it every so often to see if you're on the right path. And some students are circling the island, not sure where they're going. So if anything, the special ed community can teach us a lot about mapping pathways for every child.
So I want to make sure I heard the question right. You asked, what did we learn at the ARC conversation? So one of the most interesting things that I learned that actually, I had heard Guy Colombo's here, and we were both at the Deaf Thrive session with the deaf community a couple weeks ago. And a really big issue is interpreters. So finding interpreters for our students with disabilities, or our differently able students is how I like to call them. But that was a big issue that came up at Deaf Thrive, and then it also came up as I was talking to people after the ARC conversation. Do you know there is not a program anymore in the state of Washington that provides training for people to get certified as interpreters? So all the programs have been closed down. This is a huge issue. And so what are the implications? If I live in Wenatchee or Bridgeport or Omak or Brewster, it likely means I can't find an interpreter. And that's problematic, not just for our students with different learning abilities, but for our students, for other students, that's really problematic. So really thinking about, we are gonna need to advocate to open some more programs in the state of Washington. The closest place you can go is Western Oregon. That to me is really problematic. So that's one of the messages I heard. Another message that I heard loud and clear was actually from the gentleman who was one of the guys leading the forum. He's in his 30s, he's got Down syndrome, one of the most brilliant people that I have ever seen. He does speeches all over the country, and what I was reminded of is everyone is brilliant. Everyone is brilliant, and sometimes we eliminate the opportunity for people to be brilliant, and it was so amazing to see his brilliance in front of everyone.
Thank you. If you were attending a national education conference representing the state of Washington, what would you point to as our state's biggest strength, bragging point, in K-12 education? And what is our biggest challenge? How well do you feel Washington State is educating its students compared to other states?
So I think I want to speak to this from the context of having taught in 3 other places and having grown up overseas. So in terms of comparing us to other places, I think one of the things we're great at as a state is innovation. And this shows up in some places in our state and schools, but not everywhere. And so I think we do a really great job in certain places. But we are a state, when we think about Boeing and Microsoft and Google and all of these, Amazon, all of these corporations that are really promoting innovation, we see some of it in school, not enough yet. And so I think we have this incredible opportunity to think about how could we begin to replicate just a model of innovation, innovative thinking. How could we begin to replicate that more? But I think we are doing some really great innovative work in the state. We just need to highlight it. And where is it happening? There is a really great innovative school in Twisp, by the way. Twisp is a tiny little school district, but they have a really amazing innovative model. They don't have a ton of money. They just made a choice. We're going to try this new thing. Where do we have growth? Seattle Public Schools right now is the 5th worst achievement gap in the nation. Seattle Public Schools. That to me is it's unacceptable. In Seattle, of all places. And so we've got a lot of work to do, and I want to see that as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for growth. If we can close the opportunity gap in Seattle, we can close it anywhere. And so I believe we've really got to work with the school district to help think about where are places we're doing this well, where can we shore it up, and then how can we replicate those practices.
So nationally, the data would say we're like, right? Our graduation rate sort of falls right there with everybody else. You can look at our 3rd grade reading scores now. You can start to look at our assessments, particularly when it's sort of peer compared with common assessments like Smarter Balance, and you'd say, well, that's a state that's, you know, a little above average. It's a very different story if you look at it based on how much we invest per student. And then we start to look like a state that's outperforming its investment. And imagine what we would do if we were funded the way the top 10 performing states are in terms of their investment per child. Now, money does not solve everything, but if we are performing the way we are with the resource we have, imagine what happens when school districts can open up innovative programs. When they can see kids for who they are and say, we're not sticking 34 in geometry, we're actually going to bifurcate this class and give you some options to learn your applied math skills or your science skills. Imagine what happens if we bring art and music back into our schools so that the things that kept kids in school for so long stay in school to retain them. I would say something we're actually pretty good at is dual credit. We've been a national leader for more than 25 years, getting kids college credit while in high school at a very affordable price. It's a model that we should actually be growing. I think many, many more students are capable of this and ready, but we don't reach them the way we ought to. And our SAT scores reflect that we're a pretty decent state about meeting kids who are on the high end of achievement. 9 out of the last 10 years, we've been #1 in the country for SAT performance for the number of students we test. That's not good enough. Until we're #1 across the income demographic and race ethnicity, then we should not be happy about any of that data.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna move into our lightning round.
Lightning round.
Lightning round. In front of each of you is a card, one red and the other green. We're going to ask you each a series of yes or no questions. Please show red if your answer is no or you disagree, and show green if your answer is yes or you agree. Are you ready?
I know, this is not good.
Life is not binary.
There's a lot of gray in here.
All right, first one. Right now, to pass a bond to raise funds to build schools, a local bond ballot measure must have 60% plus one. There's that of the vote.
We don't need this anymore.
Okay, I'll start that over. Right now, to pass a bond to raise funds to build schools, a local bond ballot measure must have 60% plus one of the vote. Do you support changing the law so a simple majority of voters, 50% plus one, can pass a bond? See, that was easy. Okay, number 2, should the legislature revise the definition of basic education to include early learning, so learning for pre-kindergarten children?
Yeah, that's it.
You're trying for gray and it's
I
not
am.
there. Okay, do you support linking smarter balanced assessment scores to high school graduation?
So say,
Do you support linking smarter balanced assessment scores to high school graduation? Should the state Supreme Court consider closing down schools as a sanction to force the hand of the legislature to complete? I didn't even finish the question. You guys want to hear the rest of the question? To complete the remaining work in the McCleary case, as the current state superintendent Randy Dorn recently suggested in a court filing. All right, last one. Will the Seattle Seahawks win the Super Bowl? There you have it, two of the greatest minds in the room. The Seattle Seahawks will win.